Hi, and welcome to Behind the Headlines on the SOT Radio Network. I'm Neil Bradley, my co-host, as always, Joe Quinn.
Hi there.
It's Sunday, 24th of June, 2018. This week we're discussing mass immigration. Just don't freak out just yet. Take it easy. Everyone just take a breather, because a lot of people are freaking out about it. A lot of exceptional people, let's say, are freaking out about it. Most people, are alarmed by it, but they're probably too busy watching the World Cup to really be freaking out about it. But we couldn't help but notice that it really dominated headlines on both sides of the Atlantic, in Europe and in the US last week. Probably a coincidence. There's a coincidence of things going on, but ultimately they're going to be the same kinds of reasons, the same sets of reasons for why that's the case. We read some analysis in the news this week that naturally linked the two together, but as usual, the mainstream media either leaves stuff out or it's heavily slanted in agenda-ridden takes on why things are happening. I mean, it's most noticeable in the US, I think, Joe, with the Trump bashing. Like, it's all Trump's fault that everything's gone wrong, when clearly he was... The reason he got elected was because things were going wrong.
Right.
And people wanted some serious change. What was it that kicked it off in the US in the last week, 10 days?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm automatically suspicious of it, in terms of the fact that this kind of thing has been going on for the past 6 or 7 years at least, where under Obama, in fact, they, kids were being taken away from parents. The thing that seems to have, I mean, you didn't hear anything about that then. There was no outcry or whatever, but maybe it's because of Trump's just in April there, he declared a kind of zero tolerance policy for any undocumented illegal immigrants coming across the southern border. And I suppose in a misguided humanitarian move as part of that, which I suppose has been the case all along, is whenever you get parents with adults with children, the parents are kind of separated and sent back immediately, or rather, the parents are detained or taken to some detention place. But you basically don't. I mean, in the same way you wouldn't detain or process an adult in the same way you process a child. I mean, they just decided on this. Way back when, several years ago, they decided on separating parents from children. It's not very clear why, other than just kind of the formal kind of procedure where you don't process children the same way you process adults, basically.
Is it a way of stopping some loophole that they suspect is being exploited, so that if you have a kid, the kid has more rights to asylum, to stay, to citizenship eventually, and something like that?
I don't think so. The other problem is that I think that this figures mostly in the current furor is that there are a lot of children, officially children, as in under 18s, coming across the border on their own. Of course, the images you've seen are of small babies, because that tugs at the heartstrings the most and stuff. But the major problem in terms of children being officially children under 18s being put into detention cages or whatever, or detention cells or whatever, is that they're coming across the border. A lot of them are coming across the border on their own, unaccompanied minors, basically, coming across the border. But this was, I mean, it was part of the Trump policy. It was part of the Obama policy as well. But like I said, Trump announced a zero tolerance, basically, anti-immigration, which is, like you said, it's kind of his mandate in a certain sense. And then, of course, the media's all over it. And you have to be suspicious of the fact that, for the past, 18 months now, the kind of liberal, let's say, media, the leftist, CNN, anti-Trump media have been just looking for absolutely anything to demonize him with, right? So this is obviously you have to factor that in terms of the extent to which it's being played up, or the extent to which you're seeing it, and it's pretty shocking to see, actually, the how far and wide it spreads. I mean, I see people on Facebook, from Ireland, from where I'm from, and friends, and they're as outraged as any American, any leftist, quote unquote, bleeding heart liberal in the US is about this. You have Europeans just outraged. It's just perfectly designed to tug at people's heartstrings, right? The idea of little kids, being taken away,
It works every time.
from their parents and put into cages, right? I mean, it's just presented in the most horrible, horrible way. The reality is obviously much more, probably a lot more nuanced than that. This isn't evil Trump who hates kids, delighting in wrenching them from their parents' embrace and throwing them into cages.
Right.
Like I said, this has been a policy that and kids were separated from their parents way back in 2011, 2012 under Obama. So it's just the only thing that gave rise to this, I suppose, is the fact that Trump just went, okay, let's double down on this. Let's stop them all. We're going to tighten up the policy. And as, like I said, a zero tolerance policy, basically.
Which was announced this week by Jeff Sessions.
In April.
It
was announced, yeah. So just getting going. It took a few months to really kind of gain some traction, I suppose.
Okay.
And get into the media.
Now this week, right off the bat, the images of children used. I mean, Time took one of them, and then this little girl who's screaming at in the middle of the night somewhere in the Badlands in the south of the U.S. looking up. They took her and they put her with Trump looking down at her, just grinning. It's this big cheesy grin, right? Now somebody's already found out that image. The story in this case was that this child was wrenched from her parents there and then on the spot, but people who were there said, in fact, that never happened. She was allowed to go with her parents.
Right.
That's one specific case. But another egregious example of the manipulation of imagery and children and getting people all riled up was the fact that one of the first images put out showing people behind some kind of wired fence cages, they were describing it as, was actually an image taken from several years ago, right?
Yeah.
When this began under President Obama.
Yeah. But that's what I've been saying. Yeah, I mean, it's cynical. I mean, people. I don't know. People like a lot of people like having their emotional chain yanked. It seems, or certainly they don't have much of an aversion to that happening. Or they don't have much of a. I don't know. It's some kind of an organ maybe that some people have, or some people have that works better than others, where you just something feels off about a situation where we get this impression that you're being toyed with, you're being, and maybe it's people who just feel that they're being provoked or encouraged to feel strongly about this, and some people just go, yeah, that doesn't feel right to me. They want to stop right there and say, hang on a minute, let me work this out, let me try and figure out what's going on here, because that's an alarm bell for them. And other people just automatically just go with it. They love it. They just, I mean, if there's some drama and some outpouring of grief and sympathy and stuff to be done, then they're fully on board with that. So it just depends on the kind of person, I suppose. But
I rather suspect it's the same people very often over and over again. Do you remember Coney 2012?
Right.
Turned out to be a CIA PR op.
Right.
To demonize correctly, probably, a warlord in Uganda.
Yeah.
Like, people are going to be able to fact check something in the heart of Africa right now.
And even under Obama.
But it went viral.
Yeah. And then afterwards, Bring Our Children Home, where there was a bunch of by Boko Haram.
Yeah, 2,000 babies taken by
young girls. Yeah, and I mean, there's a whole backstory to that made it not quite so simple as well. The
facts eventually trickled down. There were a couple of hundred kids, and it was debatable as to whether they were kids or not. They were older.
Right.
So a lot of them voluntarily stayed, which typically happens. Stockholm syndrome and all that.
Right. So it's just one. I suppose once you've been exposed to that kind of thing enough times, or if you've had your emotional chain yanked enough times, and then you realize afterwards that it wasn't true, or so you got burned enough times, then you're just, I suppose, more skeptical of that kind of thing, And at the same time, you try and not, lose your humanity in that respect. You don't become a completely cynical type thing, but. There's an awful lot of that going on. We know there's an awful lot of that going on. I mean, we've been talking about it for years, obviously, about the appeals to people's sense of humanity, appeals to people's sense of sympathy for the other, for other people, for poor people, whatever, around the world, and how that is used very often for nefarious purposes, for imperial, adventures, basically, to justify wars, to justify invasions. You can quote stuff like in Libya or in Iraq, Saddam's weapons of mass destruction, he's an evil man. Libya, Gaddafi's killing his own people. Syria, Assad is killing his own people, and then pictures of young babies, all that kind of stuff. It's the babies type thing. And I mean, we've seen that enough. We've seen the babies thing enough, used by the media, by governments in the West, enough to realize that, you're being sold a line of BS of one type or another. When that happens at this point, or at the very least, you really should just stop and go, listen, I'm not going there again. I'm not doing it again, What was what George W. Bush said once? Fool me once, shame on you, no, won't get fooled again. Whatever. Yeah. that famous quote. That's where it's at. And in the US, I mean, the whole immigration thing, people don't really seem to care about immigration. I'm not saying that people don't seem to care about it in the sense of trying to understand why it's happening, what's happening, and even looking at the history of it and understanding the whole concept of immigration, the history of immigration to the US, particularly from the South. Obviously, this is the major issue for the US. They don't care to try and understand that. Not that even understanding it is going to provide a solution. Or an easy solution, but certainly, and in fact, I think that's what people should do, and that's what people don't want to do, because they want an easy solution. Because if you look at a situation in enough depth and look at the history of it and all that kind of stuff, you realize that there's not a lot of black and white. It's much more nuanced than people would, than the media in particular, would like you to think, and it's much more difficult, therefore, to come up with a solution. But people don't like that.
There's going to be a lot of structural reasons behind it.
Right.
Structural reasons that will inevitably point you to a whole set of factors that need to be adjusted, including ultimately one's own behavior and participation in a system that is part of it.
Right. And people don't want to go there. I mean, in the US, obviously, the major immigration flow comes from Mexico. I think it's about 55% of illegal immigrants into the US on average in recent years, or 55% are Mexicans. But then the next few down the list would be El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. And the presidents, the prime ministers of those three countries who are implicated in this decision by Trump, this zero policy decision on taking kids away from immigrant parents, they have spoken out against, this policy, and that they welcome Trump's backtracking on it, basically, where they wouldn't separate families anymore, but they still want to know, what's the deal here, and this is inhuman what you're doing, basically. And that's kind of interesting, because the presidents, the politicians, or the political class of those countries, and including Mexico, understand something that maybe that they understand explicitly what the people and the immigrants understand implicitly, which is that there is a long-term kind of unspoken agreement, effectively, between, in particular, Central American countries and the US, in that they're basically neighbors. More importantly, the US for decades has been all over those three countries that I mentioned, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, going back to 1954. And by being all over them, by the US being all over those countries, of course, I mean, generally speaking, or specifically, I mean that they've been involved in multiple coups in those countries, and effectively
and proxy wars,
and looting those countries, and making sure that and they do bear a significant responsibility for the economic,
for the arrested development of these places,
or underdevelopment of those countries, which is one of the primary factors for people immigrating. These are the quote-unquote banana republics, which is a phrase that goes back to
Guatemala,
right back to the beginning of the 20th century for several of the countries, not just Guatemala, but Honduras and El Salvador as well, and other further south Latin American countries, were basically bananas were a big thing at a certain point in time among other fruits and
United
businesses.
Fruit Company.
And they just bought up massive, large, like millions and millions of acres in these countries and used them to produce bananas, as one example, and shipped all the profits back to, the US basically, and created a lot of problems in the country in the sense of when these big corporations in these relatively small countries like El Salvador and Honduras and Guatemala even, they're basically kicking farmers off land. Farmers no longer have access to land or cheap land or whatever. So that's been going on, and since 1954, for example, in the coup, the CIA, well-known CIA coup in Guatemala, there have been several coups or assisted coups in one way or another in both El Salvador and Guatemala as well, by the CIA, who are just have kind of free run of the place, or had free run of the place for a long time, and still do, have been entrenched in those countries for so long. They have a lot of influence, and those countries are what they are today as a direct result of CIA and US direct involvement in their economies and their politics. So, yeah, that's known and understood. I mean, I think they used to call I think the name for Honduras at one point was the USS Honduras.
Right.
The whole country.
It may as well have been a battle carrier.
Like a ship basically.
Oh.
It's not so big, so it was just like a big ship, because there's so many US Marines there, and obviously with them a lot of intelligence agencies and stuff. So and there's an understanding that's been there's in a certain sense a cultural exchange or a cultural enmeshment between the US and those countries that has been there for such a long time. Those people, I mean, when they want to improve themselves, or in a certain sense, America's been their kind of sugar daddy, but really nasty one in a certain sense, and America owes them, and this is understood by a lot of the people in those countries, that to a large extent it's their right, they're entitled to go to America because they know the history of American involvement in their countries, American influence in their countries. Therefore, there should be some reciprocation. We should be allowed to go there. So it's like, and that's why this is smarting in a certain sense, particularly with the political class, because it's like, hang on a minute, we let you into our country. We basically, you basically overthrew leftist governments who may have kicked you out and given the land back to the Guatemalan people, or kept resources for the Guatemala or El Salvador or Honduran people. So you're responsible to a certain extent for the way we live there and the way the country operates politically and economically. And so, you can't back out of it. It's very similar in a certain sense the way the way Europeans have responded to Trump's tariffs, Trump's trade war and stuff. It's like, what are you doing? This isn't part of the deal. This is not how it works. This is not how it works based on the way that you set it up. After the Second World War, America rules the world, right? America is basically opens its door to everybody, and like I used the phrase a couple of weeks ago, whatever. America's like a big fat sow, and all these countries are piglets suckling on its teats. And it's like, there's reciprocal kind of relationship there. You know what I mean? And it's for you to suddenly just turn around and unceremoniously boot us out and say we're not friends anymore. It's just like, what the hell are you doing? Not only is it like not cool, but it's like, how do you expect to change all this? I mean, we're globalized. We're all in it together, basically. You can't just suddenly turn around and say we're not friends anymore and it's all going to change. What the hell are you talking about? And it took a while for Europeans to, and still is taking a while for them to kind of come to terms with that. And the same may happen for different reasons, for immigration reasons, with Mexico, with Central American countries. Trump, Trump seems to be making enemies, but we can't say that it's absolutely for the wrong reasons, or that it's a bad thing. Although it's a difficult and painful thing, obviously, when you separate, when you have to kick the kids out type of thing. Although I'm not saying that's not actually the way it is. I'm not saying that America is like the benevolent...
Bad pun. Yeah. Exactly. The issue at hand this week,
right? Exactly.
Kicking babies, but
I'm not even saying that's really the way the relationship is. But that's the kind of way that's the kind of animosity, the acrimony involved is similar to that. Let's say, when you kick your kids out of the house, type of thing.
This answers the question that I've had for a while now: how, in God's name, do successive, for example, Mexican governments mind? Just consider the brain drain well, I suppose the elites in large part probably are fine, say in Mexico City. So it's not quite a brain drain. A brain drain is it's more of a reference to what happened to Russia in the 90s. But simply the resource drain of losing so many people. Do they themselves not want a wall as well to, get things properly shaped up at home? Well, I spoke with one of we have a Mexican editor of SOT, on Spanish SOT, and he said, yeah, you got to understand that there is a tacit acceptance on behalf of Mexico City that a lot of people will leave, hook up with people they know in the United States, earn money, those who can find work, and they do work, and send it back home. And that is a superb source of cash,
right,
for Mexico.
Yeah,
ultimately for tax coffers, but simply hard cash. And that's probably one of the key planks in what you just described of the reciprocal, understood, between the lines arrangement that Mexico's had with the United States.
Yeah, I mean it's foolish. I don't think there's anything wrong necessarily with Trump's isolationist approach, because I think it would be good for the world, but at the same time, it's a no-win situation where, in order to change that, to break those bonds, to break those ties that have been there for at least 70, 80 years, it's going to be painful. So there's no easy way to change things for the better, i.e. there's no way to do it without there being some amount of pain, But I think change is kind of necessary, It's at this point, it's useful. I mean, we have said it for a long time. The more the world goes pushes or moves towards a kind of multipolar world, with, like we've talked many times previously, with China and Russia and other countries basically asserting themselves and coming online as major powers, and you have this balance. You have, it's no longer a monopoly. It's a competitive market basically, and that's good for business, right? It's good for business, and it's good for the business of government, of governments around the world, of running the world basically. More competition, So if we have to choose, that's the one we go for. But we realize that it's going to be difficult. The separation is going to be an acrimonious one. It's going to be an unpleasant one. So yeah, but Mexico's the big issue. When people in America, in the US, are accused of calling everybody Mexicans, it's for good reason. But 55% of the illegal immigrants are Mexicans. And the rest are. So for the average American, when the majority of people come across the borders who are illegal immigrants doing the crappy jobs that Americans don't want to do, or saying they're Mexicans, then if the odd one comes along and says, I'm not Mexican, I'm from Honduras, they're going to go, Mexico, whatever.
Hence the joke, anything south of the border is Mexican.
Well, that's because of immigration. That's the reason. It's not because of
their experience.
Yeah.
And it's Trump being a hard-nosed. Arguably, if in this context, it's an American president being responsible as well, because it's actually also Trump's human side. Because the number one issue with the electorate is immigration in the United States, and that's not because all Americans either have always been or suddenly turned racist. It's because of the harsh reality that a lot of people face, especially in the southern states, but not necessarily just in the southern states anymore, with all the attendant problems that come with, like, if in the old days the cash crops that were part of the arrangement were bananas, what's the cash crop today? Drugs. And that brings a whole ton of problems with it too.
Various different problems, like gang members. The extent to which you can't talk in general or across the board, like all Mexicans.
It's minority, right? Of course, tiny minority.
But it doesn't matter that it's a tiny minority. That people can't easily discriminate. You know what I mean?
Unless they've got tattoos all over their face. But okay.
But if even a small percentage of illegal immigrants turn to crime, which isn't strange in a country because they're there illegally, they can't get a job, they turn to crime of some description. Well, then they're going to tarnish everybody else who isn't engaged in criminal activity, and you can't blame the host population for thinking ill or for just going for stereotypes, because it's true that most of the crime in a certain area in the US is being carried out by illegal Mexican immigrants or Mexican gangs or whatever. It doesn't mean that every Mexican in the world obviously is a criminal, but you have to speak directly to that. And this is why the reason that governments, politicians and stuff don't want to talk about this is because they're afraid that the average person, they're afraid that the average person is too stupid to differentiate, and that you will just spread racism if you tell the truth about racial stereotypes.
It's rubbish because settled immigrants in the United States, so Mexican Americans, voted in huge numbers that just stunned people for Trump.
Right. Yeah.
So they agree. And it wouldn't be a majority, of course. The majority would easily have their heartstrings pulled the other way.
Right.
Probably out of a misplaced sense of patriotism or kinship with new arrivals and so on.
Yeah, but it's interesting that this. I mean, it's interesting enough. Like you mentioned at the beginning of the show that this is happening at the same time in Europe as it is in the US. But it's been going on it's ongoing in the EU for at least 3 years now. About 3 years, let's say. 2015 was a big deal with illegal immigration stuff. But the immigrant influx into Europe has been happening for 3 years. It's almost like America just kind of caught up with Trump. But it's interesting to. I mean, the figures for immigration into the US aren't, haven't skyrocketed, aren't skyrocketing. They kind of tend to ebb and flow. I don't think anybody knows particularly why they kind of go up and down from year to year over a few years. So certainly Trump has been talking about, he talked about 2.7 million or 27 million or 270 million. He talked about millions anyway of immigrants. So he throws out kind of scare figures and stuff. But doesn't seem to be any evidence that this year, for example, is any worse than previous years, taking into consideration that the figures ebb and flow, rise and fall. The same is true in Europe, where this year, right now, there's a crisis in Europe where they're basically calling it an immigrant crisis or an immigration crisis, but it's not so simple, and it kind of flies in the face of what's actually happening, which is that, for example, 2015 was the year that the immigration, there was the biggest influx of immigrants into Europe was in 2015, which of course was 4 years 4 years after the destruction of Libya by NATO, which caused a lot of immigration, and also was about 3 years into the Syrian civil war. So you had a lot of immigrants came in 2015. It was a big crisis, but apparently Europe dealt with it. And now in 2018, 3 years later, suddenly there's an immigration crisis again. But the numbers aren't, if you look at the actual figures, the numbers are nowhere near as high as they were in 2015. So why is this being called an immigration crisis today when it was arguably much, much worse in 2015? Well, again, you have to kind of, in a certain sense, look at the Trump effect, or the Trump factor in Europe. By that, I mean basically the rise of kind of right-wing, conservative, isolationist, nationalistic type parties. That's what's actually going on in Europe today. That's why European heads of state are meeting today, actually Sunday, in Brussels to discuss this immigration crisis. And it's not so much about the number of immigrants coming into the country, coming into Europe, into the EU, but it's about the fact that there has been, political events, recent political events have really precipitated most specifically the election of a coalition, a right-wing nationalistic anti-EU coalition in Italy, who have pretty much said, the leaders of which have said, immigration is stopping now. And you can understand, particularly Italy. There's other more southern European countries who have been screaming and shouting about it over the past few years, but haven't had the voice that Italy has because it's a big country. But the fact that this new Italian government has basically said no more immigration, and very kind of dramatically, I suppose, turned away a ship just this past week, a ship of immigrants that tried to dock in the southern Italian port. They sent it back to sea, basically. This is what has brought it to a head, basically. That because Italy is basically now saying no more immigrants. And that's the only thing we can put that down to is that the fact that there's been a political change, in the country. That there's a right-wing political party, two of them actually form a coalition in Italy, and they just decided no more immigrants, and they're kind of Eurosceptic or whatever, but they're drawing a line at immigrants for a start, and it's understandable, Even though the inflow right now in 2018 isn't as big as it was in 2015, they've had to absorb the flow since this, the flow in 2015 and in 2016, in 2017. So they're just calling a halt to it, basically, and it's understandable that they would do that. That there's a certain point where, they're quoting figures. They're saying basically, I think they said 170,000 immigrants into Italy over the past few years, costing, according to this new Italian government, it's costing them 5 billion every year to house these immigrants, 170,000, and they just want to say, they're just saying, okay, it has to stop somewhere, so we're going to stop it right here. And Europe has got its knickers in a twist about it. Brussels, the Central Powers in Europe, have got their knickers in a twist because, well, they're afraid in general of the rise of right-wing nationalist parties. I mean, being anti-immigration is just one symptom of a broader spectrum of kind of policies that these right-wing parties in Europe would adhere to, and their European central authorities are just afraid of if they don't do something about these complaints that these new right-wing parties in Europe have, then these right-wing parties will push it to the point where they'll leave Europe and the whole European Union project will come crashing down. That's the only reason that Merkel and Macron, who were happy to accept this influx of refugees over the past, or immigrants over the past few years, they're now saying, okay, we have a problem. We need to do something about this. Well, why? Why do you think you have a problem now when you obviously had a problem in 2015? You don't, and you don't really have such a big one now in terms of numbers. Well, the reason they have a problem now is because, because there's been a public backlash, and a public backlash that has manifested in the election of right-wing parties, or the dramatic increase in support for right-wing parties in Europe. And one of the major aspect of it is, of the support for those parties amongst the population, is immigration. There's nothing else that explains it.
Yeah, the EU's dealing with this has been completely ham-fisted. They haven't done nothing up till now. What they've tried to do is to coordinate all countries together on one policy. So they try to get everyone to agree on quotas. The eastern countries, particularly Hungary, said no effing way. Mm-hmm. Then he's re-elected on that basis.
Right.
And now populism is more entrenched than before, at least in Hungary's case. The policies they try to do, they've had EU troops. I'm not even sure who they are. I guess they're regular soldiers from some donor countries in Europe. They've had them in Libya mm-hmm. on an ad hoc basis, but it's part of an ongoing plan that's still in the works. It's so like they haven't actually come up with a plan and said we're doing this. They come up with a number of plans, but they haven't actually implemented any of them today. They're still trying to get everyone on the same mm-hmm. page to do it. But they can't while there's new governments coming in and saying, no, we're not having any part mm-hmm. of this at all. Mm-hmm. That's why there's the emergency summit this weekend, mm-hmm. today, in fact, in Brussels, to try and do something. In the meantime, Italy, for example, is blocking ships. And they're not blocking all ships. They have let one in just today, I think. Mm-hmm. And it's producing like these crazy spats between the countries because a lot of them, they're trying to get through Italy. There's just a transit route, right, just like Greece was, to get into the more prosperous Northern Europe.
I want to go to France.
What's happening at the French border with Italy? They're literally kicking them in the head, saying, no, get back, get lost. And then you have the hypocrisy then of Macron telling Italy to stop being fascist, basically. Mm-hmm. And they're replying, but then you've got people at the border, you won't let them through.
Right.
So we're left to deal with the problem. That's why we're going on our own unilaterally, and mm-hmm. we're saying we're clamping down on letting ships in the port, which is why you had that incident with the ship was called the Aquarius. They wouldn't mm-hmm. let it dock. It ended up going to Spain. It's completely ad hoc. One of the grand schemes, it was actually Macron's idea, it was announced last year, was to, they had a summit in Africa. Do you remember the one where Macron went and he made a bit of a tit of himself by embarrassing himself by trying not to be all colonial but coming across as a condescending colonial chief? Well, they announced a 44 billion euro package deal with a number of North African countries where they would tackle the roots of the problem there.
Right.
That's been the main theme. We obviously need to do something over there before they come here. I don't know how far along that is, but I do know that one thing that was kicked into place, so it started, this program, was that they started paying migrant smugglers in Libya to stop doing it. That's been going on for about a year.
Yeah, that wasn't a problem before Libya was destroyed by NATO, by the French, basically.
They're basically trying to rebuild Libya, bring back its function that it had before as a bulwark against Africans coming to Europe.
Idiots. I mean, they're just...
And they're doing it by paying the smugglers to not do it. The smugglers have been upholding their end of... They get paid, therefore, by Europe to not do it. They've been upholding their end of the bargain by, in some cases, sinking the ships. And then it looks bad in Europe, and Europe goes, that's really evil. You shouldn't be doing that to migrants. Poor migrants come to Europe. Publicly. But privately, they're paying them. Implicitly, they're saying, shoot them in the head if you have to. Do not let them cross. Although some are allowed to cross. The idea is that they'll be processed in place in Africa before they come. Some of them. But what it's effectively doing is it is stemming the flow. That's why it has dipped down from 2015. But there are still huge numbers amassing, and they still want to come. The UN just this month actually put out a report and said while flows into Europe have gone down, way down since 2015, there are more refugees globally than ever before. So, another layer of the insanity is that the people they're paying in Libya to stop them crossing are now millionaire people smugglers who were the rebels that the EU used to overthrow Gaddafi.
Right.
All of them with ties to ISIS. In fact, this week also, news this week, was the UN agreed to sanction, in particular, 4 individuals in Libya who are now rich, apparently. All 4 of them, either ISIS or groups affiliated with ISIS. Terrorists, basically. They're paying terrorists to stop doing it. It's insanity upon insanity, and
well, it's not strange that Europeans would or Americans would pay terrorists for something, for anything. I mean, they've been doing it for a long time.
So Macron is technically correct when he's lambasting Italy this week and saying, he basically said, "What immigration crisis?"
Yeah.
Insofar as the official numbers are way back down to like 2012 levels.
But there's still 170,000 of the ones that came in between 2012, 2013, 2015 in particular that are still living in Italy, and they're not moving out of Italy because the French won't let them through, the Austrians won't let them through. Any border into Eastern Europe, obviously not going to go east. They want to go west. So it's really only it's Austria or out of Italy, it's Austria or France, and France and Austria are basically closing their borders and saying no, keep them in Italy, and Italy then has to spend the money. I mean, what are 170,000 illegal immigrants from Africa, from wherever, going to do in Italy? They don't speak the language, they maybe don't have a lot of skills to do any jobs, whatever. A lot of them are basically have to be supported by the state, and that's costing Italy money. So it's not like just because the immigration flow reduces from a peak in 2015 that it's the end of the problem. Italy still has to house and look after a large number of those immigrants.
I have an article here. I want to pull it up. It has a bit more detail on what I just said about the UN sanctions this week. Here it is here. Let's see if we can make this a bit bigger. Okay. So, unprecedented UN sanctions slapped on, quote, millionaire migrant traffickers. There are 4 Libyan nationals and 2 others, 2 Eritreans, Um, the incredible thing about this is that they know these guys have long-standing links with ISIS. Hang on a second. Find this quote. Here, look at this. Long-standing links with ISIS, right? Not only that, okay, the Dutch prosecutor's office, I think they were involved with drafting this statement or the sanctions resolution by the UN. Describes these guys and the sheer scale of their business. They have property all over the world. They obviously have connections. I mean, you don't just have, a worldwide network and the financing without having serious connections. The Dutch foreign minister, here's another gem. One of the guys who was sanctioned is officially a commander in the Libyan Coast Guard, tasked with not letting migrants cross. Right. So obviously, for the right money, he will let you cross. The Dutch foreign minister, Stef Blok, this week commenting on the UN sanctions, it says, what this shows, our sanctions, is that we will go to whatever place or organization concerned and punish the people responsible, even if it is an organization that we are working with in other fields.
Right. Now, the level of corruption there is obviously ridiculous. I mean, people like Steven Pinker and Jordan Peterson is also a big advocate of this idea that things are getting better. Things are only getting better. And they have all the statistics to show that so many, millions and millions of people are being lifted out of poverty over the past, few decades. There's far fewer wars, far fewer deaths from wars, all that kind of stuff. Historically, and you can go back as long as you want to show that, things are getting better. The level of the living standards of people around the world are getting better all the time, et cetera, et cetera. So, but that doesn't, there's stuff going on behind the scenes where there's a facade of kind of representative, responsible democracy in the West and all that kind of stuff. But then you just have to scratch the surface a little bit and you see this, like, it's a mixture of corruption and greed mixed with, which often happens, mixed with fecklessness, in the sense of we're like that example you just gave of the EU working with groups that are former terrorists who are working against EU policies, but the EU is also working with them in other fields, type of thing. It's just like, what could go wrong is the question. Obviously, everything not only could go wrong, but is going wrong right now with that situation. And I mean, so that's something that these people who say that things are only getting better don't seem to take stock of, because they just believe the official line. They look at the statistics and the figures, but they don't look into the levels of kind of corruption that are I suppose spreading or infecting the whole system, progressively, where there's a greater and greater distance from between politicians, people tasked with like responsible governance, and what's actually happening in the country and the lives of ordinary people in the country. I mean, there's other aspects of that as well, in terms of just people having, there being people living meaningful lives, because you can contrast the rapid increase in technology and the increase in standard of living that has provided for many people around the world with rapid or an equal decrease in a satisfaction or satisfactory lives that people are living, or meaningful lives that people are living. So it's not so simple as just to say that because everybody, more people are not starving or have food and have a house. It's not so simple to say that means that everything is we're facing into a rosy future. You know what I mean? There are other factors that are not being taken care of that are much more pernicious, or present a much more bleak outlook for our global civilization.
You made a point before we came on air that actually might rescue the basic point made by someone like Steven Pinker. So Pinker's basically going through all the basic stats and showing how globally people are better off. They have better access to water, to food, to basic resources, to transport, etc. So the point you made, that you asked the question, how do people on the move pay for it?
Yeah. Well, look, that's
They
one.
must have
aspect.
hard cash. Here's the basic stat, right? In 2015 alone, these migrant smuggling networks, basically ISIS or whoever got on first in Libya, made between 4.7 and 5.7 billion euros from people paying them hard cash to get there.
Mm-hmm.
Also cashed their mind back to the Syrians in Turkey, paying $2,500 a pop just to make that boat hop onto any Greek island and thus into the EU.
Right.
That's hard cash.
Right. Well, yeah. The point I was making was that obviously that's in times gone by. I mean, this immigration, people wanting to come from poorer countries to richer countries, isn't a new phenomenon, right? An immigration crisis isn't necessarily a new phenomenon. People have moved or have wanted to move, let's say, or attempted to move throughout history, and sometimes successfully, sometimes not successfully. But today, because of this, things are only getting better aspect where technology is spreading and lifting people out of poverty. That's a function of the West. Let's say the West is spreading its wonderful technology and its living standards around the world as it spreads itself around the world, as particularly the American empire spreads around the world. People, they enter countries with their, businesses enter countries, and multinational corporations enter countries, and they do provide jobs and wealth for those people in those countries. And that spreads down, trickles down to some extent or whatever, and so it gives people more money. The spread of wealth has increased. But that is one aspect of the immigration crisis, because once those people in those countries who previously were not able to move anywhere, because if you've got a 3,000-mile trip to go from, say, somewhere in Africa to Europe, how are you going to, if you're dirt poor, how are you going to finance that? You know what I mean? There's boats, you're not getting a plane, but there's cars, boats, you're not going to walk all the way. And how are you going to feed yourself all the way, you and your family and all that kind of stuff? So you have to have cash to do that.
What would happen in the 1980s? Famine.
Well, you had
remember?
famines, yeah. So it's
Feed the world.
Right.
That was the extent of the Western empathy with them, because they would all sit there in North Africa and starve to death.
Right.
But now they're not only not starving to death,
because of
they're
technology.
under hardship, a lot of them, but
they're able
to
move. They're able to move, yeah. So they're a victim. The West, the best you could say about the situation is the West, in that respect, is that the West is a victim of its own largesse. The immigration crisis is a downside, let's say, of Western largesse to the poorer countries in the world, where they've facilitated the movement of these people, to some extent facilitated. But there's other factors as well, obviously. There's wars, conflict. Big thing in Mexico, but big aspect of the Mexican move, of the Mexican immigration over the past number of years, it hasn't just started this year or last year, is there's a lot of violence in Mexico, a lot of gangs and drugs and stuff, and in other South American countries, and that's one aspect of some people anyway wanting to get the hell out of there, But America's just seen, for Central European countries, America's seen as Valhalla, it's just like, it's the American dream, it's everything, and, to some extent it is, depending on the person's situation who's leaving. I'd say a lot of people come to Mexico, or come to the US from Mexico and other Central European or Central American countries. A lot of them, I don't know what the statistics are on returns, but I'd say they're higher than most people think, where a lot of Mexicans who go to the US decide after a few years that it's not what I thought it would be, or it's not all it was presented to be, and they might realize that they actually were happier back home, Mm-hmm. So it's just a mess, it's a big mess, and it's just it's something that happens at a particular time in history, particular times in history. I think obviously the conditions are very different today than they would have been in the past. In the past, when you had mass movement of people, back then it was more to do with maybe plagues or kind of a mass, pandemics or epidemics or some kind of natural disasters, cataclysms, that kind of thing would have moved people around the place, But today it's the world just is radically different today than it ever was in the past, and it's uncharted territory in that respect,
Yeah. In Europe's case, it's very hard to. Probably the same point can be made about the US as well. The economics. there've been a number of statements that suggest an economic motive on behalf of the powers that be in both continents to open the doors and want a large number of people. The obvious thing would be cheap labor.
Right.
But a less obvious and a difficult one to tease out, but again, it's from their own mouths, is that the actual people are needed as a resource. I know Juncker, at least, if not also other EU officials, have said, well, the population's aging. Like, who's going to work for us?
Yeah.
He didn't say that's not an exact quote, but he said it in so many words.
Right. And it's not just about work. It's not just about workers. It's also about workers doing the work. It's also about workers doing the work and then paying taxes. I mean, from an economist perspective, there's not a lot of things wrong with, depending on the way it goes. There's not a lot of things wrong with having a fresh blood come into the country. As long as there's available jobs for them, because ultimately those people are going to be paying taxes of one form or another. Even if it's only sales tax when they buy stuff, they have to buy things, purchasing, consumers, consumer demand. It's good for the economy, and there are people who just look at these, a lot of them, especially in Europe, I think it's the thing that they look at first and foremost is the economics of it, and there's not a lot from an economic point of view, there's not a lot of things, not a lot of negative aspects to an extra million young, able-bodied men, for example, coming into their country, who are going to have to work in some way or other, and buy things, So, and I think Trump in the US, Trump's. I'm not sure it's economics for him as well, because there is a downside to a certain extent in southern states. But I mean, in the US, it's really only the southern states that are really concerned, or Trump would be appealing to. It's like Texas, Arizona, southern states where immigrants would immediately arrive and then move to most easily. A lot of them try to go to New York, obviously, because that's where everybody's accepted. All the immigrants are accepted in New York, right? You don't have to. In liberal New York, it's like they still take everybody supposedly, but
they don't, because in practice, as we know from plenty of demographics, New York is extremely segregated because everyone lives in a specific areas. Yeah. It's all come on in, but it's not really. It's come on in an abstract sense, but you're not ever going to live. Right. I don't want to see you. Right. Really.
Yeah. So I mean, there's competition for jobs. People come in, all that kind of stuff. It's not easy to figure out whether there's positive or negative. There's positives and negatives, the thing, and depending on your perspective, depending on your political leanings, you'll focus on the negative aspects or you'll focus on the positive aspects. Of course, positive aspects for liberal, lefty, open people with higher openness traits will be like, well, these people it's cultural diversity, right? It's cultural enrichment, right? It's just from a humanitarian perspective, America, that's what America's all about. Bring them in, house them, whatever, give them a place. We were all immigrants originally, blah, blah, blah. But that's an interesting question of when America stops being an immigrant country, How long does it have to exist for before it stops being an immigrant country? Because, I mean, like France isn't an immigrant country, England, no European country is an immigrant country. Has that history that America has that kind of self-assigned, largely identity of, bring me your poor and your etc. So how long does America have to exist before it stops being that? It's been, a couple of 100 years? Maybe it takes longer. But at some point you would think that America history would, the history would fade away a little bit and America would establish its own history as, well, in theory, it might have established itself if it had gone a different way. It might have established itself, or it has still established itself as a white, a Caucasian, a white Christian nation, right? Mm-hmm. Not just an immigration camp, right? But that's what it was for all the people most of the people who came there. All the whites that came there from Europe were all immigrants, right? I don't know, but that's what conservatives tend to want to push, and Trump wants to push is America. They have an identity, the idea of America as America's racial and religious identity, and it's a country. It's not an immigrant camp. It's basically America is white Christian, like any other white Christian nation in Europe. It's European, basically. It's just an offshoot of a European country. That's what they would like it to be. But then you have the other side of the people, the other half, let's say, or whatever percentage it is, who say that no, we're a nation of immigrants, and everybody should be welcome, you know. So yeah, I don't know.
I think it's less than half.
Probably they're just more vocal.
Hence the change of regimes in the US and in Europe potentially. The US is. I think the US can deal with this, but Europe is in a serious predicament because the upward pressure from voters to basically do what Italy's doing, and the complete fecklessness by the EU in response to this crisis it's unsustainable. I mean, if you consider that, I think this is the single most important issue for people. Whether that's should be the case or not, I think it is. It just is. It's because it's gained so much traction. I mean, the extreme characterization of it as an immigrant invasion has a lot of traction, and I think it has an unspoken traction for a lot of people. Most people will not agree with that or express it that way because they don't want to be called racist, whatever.
Yeah,
but
we'll have to wait and see. But it's not gonna. It's shaping up. It could just go away, or it could get worse. We'll have to wait and see. But I mean, we at this point, there's no way to know whether there's no way to predict that Europe's going to fall apart, or America is going to turn into a kind of under Trump is going to incarcerate all the immigrants and kick out the rest of them and all that kind of stuff. But obviously, that's not going to happen in America. America is a multicultural nation, multi-ethnic, multiracial nation. By definition, you're not going to undo that, obviously, at all. You're not going to change that, So it just looks like the prognosis would be more continuing strife until something happens, if something happens, or until people just get fed up with it and stop talking about it, or it all just settles down. People are so, individual humans and humans in groups are so fickle, and that might be a good intro for a video that we want to show about fickle people.
Which one now?
Rachel Maddow.
Oh, okay, right. Well, this is the crocodile tears from Rachel Maddow, who's of course MSNBC host in the US. Where are we now? This is her breaking the news that the White House had announced something this week. Okay, here goes. Let's play this.
The AP has just broken some new news. This has just come out from the Associated Press. This is incredible. Trump administration officials have been sending babies and other young children. Oh, hold on. To at least 3. Can we put up the graphic of this? Thank you. Do we have it? No. 3 tender age shelters in South Texas. Lawyers and medical providers. I think I'm going to have to hand this off. Yeah. Sorry. That does it for us tonight. We'll see you again tomorrow. Now it is time for the last word with Lawrence O'Donnell, where he is live in Brownsville, Texas.
Yeah.
That's Rachel Maddow. She's so choked up she can't even report the news. Is that genuine? I doubt it. It's probably genuine. It probably feels right to her, but it's fake in that she has no real experience of what most Americans, the ones that do encounter the problems that come with mass immigration. She doesn't see that reality at all. So she's living in this completely la-la land. And she thinks by crying on air that it'll strike a chord, maybe with a hardcore of her viewership, but she's completely oblivious to the fact that most people are like, whatever.
She's being completely immature as well about it, and irresponsible, really, by presenting in that way. Babies, just talking about babies. I mean, anything can be achieved in theory. Certainly, with a certain section of the population, you can achieve you can push through any ridiculous policies or get support from people for any ridiculous scheme that you have by appealing to them through the vehicle of think about the poor babies, think about the poor children, and it's totally disingenuous to do that. I mean, even if you feel that yourself, you should not do it because it's not responsible, and it's an appeal to emotion over actually informing people about the situation. And because I mean, a bunch of people crying over over abstract babies or pictures of babies is not going to solve the problem, because it's a very complex problem that has been there for quite a long time, and that kind of appeal is not going to solve any problem. So I mean, but some people like that it's a problem, and some people see through it, and some people take a more mature stance and a more appropriate stance to it, and other people just go with that, and then get out in the streets and start screaming about Trump and wanting to impeach him and stuff like that. So yeah, I don't know.
In other cases, people are openly threatening to kill Trump. Well, they have been for a while, I suppose, on Twitter and elsewhere. Peter Fonda is an actor. I know Jane Fonda. Is that related to Peter Fonda? Are they brother and sister or something?
I think. I'm not sure. Yeah.
He's the guy who was an Easy Rider, right?
Right.
He's so unhinged about this. He tweeted this week that he wanted to see Trump's son Barron be kidnapped and imprisoned with pedophiles, and then let's see if mother will stand up against the giant beep she is married to. He's completely nuts. I think Twitter has since taken that tweet down. That's why I can't show it to you. But
yeah,
it's totally unhinged, and it's doing it to a lot of people. Sarah Sanders, the press secretary for Trump, was in a restaurant yesterday, I think, and the restaurant owner asked her to leave because she works with Trump's government.
Right. That's kind of unheard of, yeah.
That's kind of like somebody's going to shoot someone maybe, and then that will be like a whole other level of.
Yeah, it could go there. But like I said, these kind of things, I mean, if you look at what else is going on in the world, there's been a lot of the dial has been turned down, let's say, on previous stories. I mean, maybe it's because it's summertime in the northern hemisphere, and things tend to get a bit more quiet. People are preparing for holidays. Politicians slack off and that kind of stuff. So, stuff doesn't happen anymore. The stuff that we're all meant to get worked up about just kind of goes away for a while until somebody turns the dial back up in the autumn when everybody comes back online. But it's like there's a World Cup going on, so a good portion of the world is watching soccer and kicking back, and the world seems to have responded in terms of the kind of dynamics that play out. Syria, for example, is on the back burner type of thing. There's still stuff going on in Syria, but you don't hear much about it from in the Western media much anymore. Maybe because I don't know. I don't think they've given up on it, but they're taking a break basically. It's taken over here and there, but there's no more all the attacks on Syria, and and then we had obviously in the past few weeks we had the North Korea business. It's kind of gone quiet as well. That's all done apparently. Now we're all friends with North Korea. Everything's going to work out just fine. So all the people who are crapping their pants about being bombed by North Korea just have to learn that lesson. Don't get so freaked out next time because it all got better. Things can be made to go away very easily. They can be made to appear out of nowhere as a crisis very easily as well, and just as easily made to disappear apparently. Brexit in the UK, kind of shenanigans still going on there, a bit of a joke. It's been a joke. It's the longest running gag in the history of politics, basically, Brexit. The Brits are still pretending that they're going to play hardball, and the bobblehead Boris Johnson, the British Foreign Secretary, said he wants a full English Brexit. No, he said he wants a full British Brexit. There might have been a pun on the full English breakfast, but he wants a full British Brexit, which is nonsense, obviously, because they can't have a full British anything in terms of the EU, because they're inextricably tied economically to the EU, and they can't just walk away without any kind of a deal, and they're totally in a weak position and have been since the vote happened. And they're not going to just be able to. They're not going to get a no-deal Brexit where the entire UK just leaves the EU without any deal whatsoever, and all ties are cut. First of all, they can't do that economically because it would basically seriously harm the British economy. And secondly, an example of that is that Airbus, which is a big European aircraft manufacturer, which has factories and manufacturing plants in various European countries, including in England, they have said that because of the threat of the Brits just leaving without any kind of a deal, that they would shut down their plants in the UK, involving the loss of thousands and thousands of jobs. And just one example. I mean, there's many other companies, multinational companies, would do the same thing. So it's just one example of like kind of the economic doomsday that is beckoning for the UK if they walk away from the situation. And so any suggestions by the British government that they're going to play hardball and walk away from it is nonsense. So that's on an economic front. On a political front, they can't just the UK can't just leave the EU because they happen to still hold on to a little part of Ireland, and they can't just walk away with a part of Ireland out of the EU because Ireland, most of the rest of Ireland, is in the EU and has no intention of leaving the EU. So they can't just take a part of the northern part of Ireland and leave the EU, take it with them in the UK as part of Brexit, because that would cause serious problems for the island of Ireland in terms of its economics, because there would have to be a hard economic border there, and also a hard, and it implies the possibility of reigniting a kind of a conflict in Ireland, because the effective removal of the border between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland was part of a peace deal after 30 years of conflict, basically. So if they were to reimpose that border as part of a Brexit, you would have a potential reigniting of some kind of a war. So on several fronts, they're just screwed, basically. So, and I'm just tired of Brexit, basically, because it's obvious what's going to happen. Obviously, what's going to happen is there's going to be some kind of another referendum in the UK, and they will vote to no longer be even thinking about leaving the EU. And then the past 3 years almost of BS basically will be exposed for just that. It will be complete. It will prove to have been a complete and utter waste of everybody's time and energy.
So you're calling it here now another referendum?
Either another referendum or some kind of a Brexit deal, which is tantamount to
not leaving.
Okay. Because there's no other option. So yeah, but there's not much else going on in the world right now. Like I said, there's just palpable sense of things kind of just being quiet and ticking over a kind of period of stasis, I suppose you might call it. And I mean that says a lot, because if you look at the news, there is a lot of crap going on, but that's stasis, in the context of the kind of stuff that has been going on over the past 10 or 20 years, the amount of chaos that has been reigning on this planet for the past 10 or 20 years, since 9/11, really. Well, what you see today, stuff happening in the world in the news today, that's what not much happening looks like. So right. That just means you should take the time now to rest up, gather yourself, gather your senses, because no doubt things are going to kick off again in the not too distant future. It'll probably get worse. That's my crystal ball gazing for today.
Get worse from a certain perspective.
Get worse from everybody's perspective, even though it'll be a result of people not really looking at the situation and seeing through it and seeing what's really going on. There'll be lots of wailing and gnashing of teeth and screaming at the moon.
It'll get worse because a large part of people's illusions are dying.
People's illusions are dying, and people trying to hold on to them, and people making stuff up, willfully indulging in hysteria is what will, and of course that's contagious, and then everybody else gets, I better be hysterical as well, let me get really worked up about this as well, when they just have totally the wrong perspective on the situation, you're not going to go out there and change the world, and this is a leftist, kind of lefty, progressive kind of mantra, or ideology, which is that we're all activists. We all need to be activists.
Well, there are a lot of them in the right too.
Well, as well, yeah. But yes, the only out I would give them, or the excuse I would give them, is that they are, to a large extent, reacting. They're not the initiators of it. But they're the ones on the right are equally capable of getting hysterical about things. But generally speaking, they're using the fuel that is given to them by leftists and progressives who want to push us all into, lead us all very quickly into a brave new utopia, a wonderful new utopia where there's no racism, no sexism, no transphobia, no
Trump,
arachnophobia, and no Trump, most importantly. That's where they want to push us all, and there's people who have heavy shoes, have lead in their feet and don't want to go there, and they're the kind of right wingers, and they'll react. They are reacting, obviously, So yeah, it's set up for a good old showdown, basically. But everybody should see it from that perspective, see it from a more detached perspective, and realize that this is a lot of it's kind of manufactured. A lot of it's manufactured in the sense of it being people's own
imaginations running wild.
Yeah,
and therefore emotions,
and getting hysterical and getting worked up, and like I said, almost willfully, because they enjoy it, because it's fun, right? It's fun to take a really hardcore, strong position and rant about something, because especially when you feel like and everybody feels this way, is that you have the moral high ground. You're being righteous in your condemnation of something, and you got to say it and feel it as much as possible. People feel good when that happens, I mean, obviously they must feel good. I'm inferring that from the fact that they keep on doing it. The people generally don't do things that they don't like to do that are painful for them, so they must enjoy getting super worked up about stuff. Give me some stuff to get worked up about. What can I get worked up about today? Of course, they have all sorts of justifications for it, but whatever. I mean, you need to take a different seeing people listen to the show need to take a different perspective, because there's plenty of people doing that kind of shit. So you don't need to be part of that. Let them handle it. Let them handle the hysterics. You don't need any more.
Don't get infected by the hysteria. Stay clear. Stay clean.
Right. Don't eat the Tide Pods.
Okay.
Yeah. So maybe we'll leave it there for this week, folks. Like we said, there wasn't much going on apart from the world's collapsing. Slowly, incrementally, supposedly. So that's the roundup for this week. We'll be back again soon, sometime. We can't say exactly when. Might be sooner than you think. Maybe not. If not, it'll be next week with another update or another analysis or another look at what's actually going on the planet behind the headlines. So until then, thanks for listening and have a good evening.
See you next week. Bye.